Welcome to the latest episode of Rich Sports Talk. If you're new to the channel, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of our latest content. Make sure to chat throughout the video, super chat to donate to the channel, and to jump to the front of the line. And of course, check us out wherever podcasts are available. The New York Mets, merely days after signing Bo Bichette, have made a blockbuster trade for a great young player. And look, this is someone we've been feeling that the Mets would go after with Luis Robert Jr. We talked about throughout the season. We talked about last season, and it didn't seem like the White Sox would be moving on by exercising his option. But the Mets made what I thought was a very shrewd move. They improved center field. They improved this lineup, and they are taking a shot on a player that, if he can play up to his potential, could be a potential all-star. So let's break down all this. And first, let's talk about the assets going to the White Sox. And if you're a White Sox fan, you have to be massively disappointed because there was a time where Robert was getting interest from around the league, was being offered top prospects, and the White Sox said no. And it's clear this was a money dump. White Sox wanted to get his $20 million off the books. The Mets, of course, with their financial backing and, of course, with their payroll, had plenty of room to take on Robert Jr. And the big thing with him, he has option contracts. So if it really doesn't work out for the Mets, if he misses significant time or it's not a good fit, the Mets can get out of this contract within a year. And if he plays well in a better lineup, who knows? Maybe he can get a big wad of cash in free agency. We'll look at his production potentially with the Mets, his fit, what this means for left field. But let's just talk about the pieces they gave up. And right now, the Mets did not give up a lot. The minor leaguer that went in this trade was a recent draft pick. It was Truman Pauly, who was a pitcher from Harvard, can hit about 96 on the radar gun, was outside the top 30. But the big name was Luis Acuna, who's a player I really liked. You could see having a role on the Mets. He'll probably get a chance to start in Chicago. And I think one of the reasons that the Mets made this move was twofold. Number one, they saw him as a role player on this roster, not an everyday player. And there was a part of me, I like Acuna's game. I love the athleticism. I was petitioning, if they didn't go out and get a center fielder, that he should be auditioning in center field. But I think one of the things you have to look at is how well they've built up this minor league system, where the Mets now have a ton of young players pushing, but you have to look behind Luis Acuna. And when you look at second and center field, it feels like the Mets have two prospects they really like in the long term, Jet Williams and A.J. Ewing. Now, A.J. Ewing's a little bit further down the system, but this is a guy that has elite outfield defensive traits, stole 70 bases in the minors last year. I think he's the long-term solution in center field potentially. And I think the Mets want to leave that open. And there's another big prospect that I also feel comes into play, and I'll talk about in a little bit. But let's talk about Robert Jr. Now, again, he's had injury issues, still 28, years removed from a year where he was in the MVP voting. But there's one thing I think you have to look at, and that's the scenery around him. Chicago has been an absolute disaster for the White Sox. And when you're asked to be the focal point on a bad team and taking those questions every night and going to the ballpark knowing you're not going to win, this is a player that I want to remind people in the last 3 seasons, do you know how many games they've lost, the White Sox? Over 320, including a season where they lost 121 games. That just eats at you as a baseball player and as a competitor. And the big thing for Robert Jr. is the Mets don't need him to necessarily be the focal point of this offense. They wanted to play great center field and be a piece of this order. If he plays up to his potential, I could see him batting in various spots within this order. If he's on a really hot streak, I could see him hitting up close to the second hole, right, with Juan Soto behind him, getting a lot of good pitches to hit. This is a player that, even in 100 games last year, still stole 30 bases. This is a base running threat, and that's one part of his game that I don't think it's talked about enough. He's got some nice pop in that bat, which we've seen with Chicago. But this is a player that you look at the upside, and even if it is just what you got last year, which, again, the numbers, 223 batting average, 14 home runs, just slightly over 50 RBIs, and people will roll eyes at, well, that's not great production. Well, you're right, that isn't. But here's the thing. It's better production than the Mets center field position. The Mets center fielders last year combined had 7 total home runs. So he had twice the home run output. This is a guy that will play better center field. And look, no shot to Tyrone Taylor. Tyrone Taylor is a nice player, but he is a fourth outfielder. He's a defensive replacement that you bring in late in ball games. He's not an everyday center fielder. The fact that this team was playing with Jeff McNeil in center last year was at one point, frankly, embarrassing. And you look at how they've rebuilt this team. For a long time, the Mets were really built on the long ball. They've really built this team now around the new rules in baseball, with the stealing becoming more prevalent with the new rule changes. You have guys now on this team that can steal 30 bases, can move runners, can basically create offense on the base pass, and not necessarily have to bash 40 home runs over the fence. It's going to be a very different looking team next year. But the big thing you look at right now is David Stern came into this offseason with a clear message: run prevention. It was a term that many Mets fans rolled their eyes at and did not like. But when you pencil in that opening day roster with Semien at second, Lindor at shortstop, and now you have Luis Robert in center, these are 3 players that could win Gold Gloves. These are players that at their peak could be one of the best players at their position defensively. And here's a good argument. Is there a better up the middle, short, second, and center field than baseball? I think you would be hard-pressed to find one. Now, there's still some interesting scenarios. I don't think Polanco's necessarily going to be the first baseman. I think he will be primarily the DH. I think Vientos will probably be the first baseman. I think this team has showed you what they think of Vientos because of that pop in his bat. They didn't want to move him in a potential deal. And I don't think the Mets are done. We've heard that they're looking at Peralta. I do think they're going to add a pitcher at some point, likely through the trade market. But I do like how this team is building this roster. I love how they have a new identity. I love how they're a better defensive team. And they're also trying to get younger. And this, to me, was a big point why the Mets made this deal. Almost unprovoked, David Stearns has been talking a lot about Carson Bench, the Mets' top 23-year-old position player prospect. It's clear that especially if he has a good spring, the Mets want him on the opening day roster. And he's a good enough defender where he could play center and not be a, quote, liability. But when you put him in left field, I think he'll be a plus defender. He's a lefty bat with some pop. He can throw 96 miles an hour from his days as being a pitcher. That is a nice fit where all of a sudden, where you want to bring up a young kid, or even if, let's say, Robert gets an injury at some point, you have Jet Williams waiting in the wings. You have guys, young players that can come up and compete for those positions. And right now, Carson Bench, this is a great lineup to be in. Put him in the 7th or 8th spot, depending on how the lineup fills out, maybe even the 9th spot. Maybe platoon him a little bit with Brett Beatty. Maybe Brett Beatty gets some reps at first base. But overall, this is a move that just makes the Mets a better ball club. And really at no risk. Basically, the Mets are trading what they considered a good bench piece, but a bench piece and a young pitching prospect years away for a player that, when right, can make a huge impact. And in this lineup, think about, you're going from basically the basement to the top of the peak in terms of lineups. Now, the Mets don't have a Dodgers lineup. I get it. But you have to look at this Met lineup and go, they're a top 10 lineup in baseball from 1 through 9. Yeah, they might not have the star power 3, 4, 5, 6, but top to bottom, this is a pretty good lineup. And don't forget, you get improvements in this lineup from having a consistent like Lindor, having a consistent player in that like Bo Bichette, having a consistent player like Juan Soto in there that can really carry this team. But when you look at this order now, you now have a guy where you bring in Luis Robert who can run. He's a great defender, and he has a bit of pop in that bat. If he's hitting 6th or 7th in this order, maybe he's the 9th hitter to be the new top of the order at the bottom of the order. I think he's going to have a good role and a big role with this team. And I'm very excited to see him play for the Mets. And I understand that some Met fans are going to be hurt they didn't get Cody Bellinger. But again, Bellinger signed for $162, 5 years with multiple opt-outs after years 2 or 3. I think this is a great fit. And at the end of the day, maybe the Mets come out of this and say, we like the younger kids to play center field in 2027 and beyond. That's great. I think that this was a smart move. This was a savvy move. You barely gave up anything. And this is also the good thing about being the Mets with this payroll. Payroll, again, we've seen this offseason, especially in free agency. It's important to land big fish, but one thing that payroll allows the Mets to do is be creative. The White Sox wanted out of this contract. The Mets could take this contract off and it's not a burden. You also saw it with the Mets, with Verlander and Scherzer. They were able to get prospects like Luis Angel Acuna because they were able to pay off the majority of that contract. And who knows, maybe this is a place where Luis Robert reinvigorates his career here with the Mets because he's in a better system. He's in a better lineup. He's in a better building. He's in an organization that is actively trying to win, as opposed to a guy. I mean, you look at the two opposite owners in sports. Reinsdorf does not want to spend a penny, and he was pissed that Steve Cohen came in. And I almost find it ironic that years later, Steve Cohen is basically pilfering arguably his biggest star from the Chicago White Sox. All right, let's get to some of your questions. Acuna wasn't going to even play this year and had no options. Robert's floor is significantly better than what Taylor gave them last year. This is a no-brainer. Low risk, high reward. And Mo, you're absolutely right. You're going to look at this lineup and like you look at last year, which was a bad year for him. He still had a better average, more home runs, more RBIs, and more steals than the Mets got out of the center field position. And oh, by the way, he plays better defense. He's going to hit the bottom of the order with no pressure to be the guy, perfect change. And look, let's say he gets going early. Could Mo, the number 2 spot in this order, be a great spot for him? He's a guy that can swipe bases. He stole 30 last year. If he starts off the season hot, what if he hits number 2? What if he hits with Juan Soto behind him, where he gets great pitches to hit? That could be an explosive lineup. Again, there's no pressure, and maybe he's at the bottom of the order. Yeah, maybe he's not going to be a 250, 260 hitter. One thing I will give him credit for is his strikeout rate went down. Again, it's above the average at 26%, but the year before it was 31%. So if he hits 230, 240, but steals 30 to 40 bags at the bottom of the order, scores a lot of runs, but more importantly, plays elite defense, it just makes your lineup better. Part of the reason I think Juan Soto got exploited at times in the outfield last year was because the Mets were average or below average in center field. They had a major liability in center field last year. And right now they've addressed it. Like second base, you can make the case wasn't their biggest issue, neither third base, but center field was. And I do think that this is going to be the best middle infield. Like name me a shortstop, second base, center field combo that's better defensively together in Major League Baseball. I'll wait. They need another outfield, still sure. I would not be just saying Benj is the guy right from the rip. And I don't think it necessarily will, Mo. I get the sense that they're done, though. The big thing I would say, too, is with this team, you also have Brett Beatty. And if you remember, the Mets were going to sign Correa years ago. They asked Brett Beatty, would he play left? And he was excited. He wanted the challenge. And he's a better athlete than people give him credit for. And the Mets really like Beatty. They really love his output. Maybe you're right. Benj doesn't start in left field, but you have Brett Beatty out there. You have Ronnie Mauricio still. Does he get to play some shots in left field? And if Mauricio isn't traded, I mean, there are some intriguing pieces still on this team. Because, again, you look at third base, you have your everyday third baseman now. First base is a little open. I think it's going to be Vientos, maybe Beatty, but I do think Beatty could be this team's starting day left fielder. And look, they have Tyrone Taylor. They have plenty of prospects in the system that they really like. I think Jet Williams will be with this team in some capacity this year. You have guys like Ryan Clifford who, again, project more first or corner outfield. Maybe they get off to a hot start in double AAA. So we'll see. I mean, the thing that this gives this Mets team is options. And you feel a lot better penciling that name, Luis Robert Jr., in center field on opening day than you would have if it was Tyrone Taylor. And again, I don't want to pick on Tyrone Taylor. Again, make sure to comment, hit that like, subscribe button so you don't miss any of our latest content. But I just look at this Mets team and I look at their top prospects right now. And again, the list will be redone shortly. But Carson Benj, again, this is a guy that David Stern has really talked up this offseason. If you've been paying attention, this is someone that he even hinted could be the opening center fielder. And that was not even, left field. Now you look at left field, And again, he's flying through the system. Maybe you want to start him at AAA a little bit earlier. But I mean, he did finish at AAA last season. He flew through AA, paying 317. Struggled down the stretch though at AAA, hitting 178, 16 hits though with 13 RBIs. Maybe they slow playing, but look, the Mets have a lot of depth. I mean, I look at guys like AJ Ewing again. I think he's probably a year away, but I could see him being a center fielder. I look at Ryan Clifford, who again at AAA, another lefty bat, not an elite defender, but you could get away with him in left field if you really needed to. I mean, this is a player that last year, again, hasn't really turned that hitting tool the way we thought it would be. But that you never know. Maybe he gets off to a hot start in camp or gets off to a hot start. I mean, the Mets do have some options here, and I do think that they're going to trade for another pitcher. I mean, you've heard about the Peralta moves. They have guys that they can move. I don't think Beatty will get moved, but will Mauricio potentially get moved? Could I see the Mets maybe moving some of these pieces? Again, it's been rumored Williams is included. Like, it's been one of the names floated with Peralta. I think the other name was Jonah Tom. Personally, I wouldn't trade the young pitchers. But this gave the Mets flexibility. And look, to be frank, I like Luis Angel Acuna. I don't think he was appreciated enough, but this probably is the best opportunity for him because when you look at this team, he was probably going to be a super base runner. This was a guy that could play late in games, but would be a pinch runner late in games to steal some bases, which again is an invaluable tool to have. And now as a whole, you would like to see the Mets potentially address. But going to Chicago, where you know he can play every day, where you're going to get a lot of at-bats, can he develop that hitting tool? Because, again, he's got that slasher type of swing. He hasn't been able to convert to a high average. Again, smaller player. He's never going to hit for a lot of power, although he's had a really good winter ball this year and driving the ball out of the ballpark. Like, this is a great opportunity for him. And if he goes and has a great career at the White Sox, all the power to him. I mean, this to me was a good risk. You're picking up a guy that has shown that at his peak, he can be an all-star level talent. And right now, you also have to wonder, too, how much is it the situation? And again, I'm not saying athletes, when they're injured and the injuries are a concern, but if you're Luis Robert Jr. and you get hurt, like, what's the incentive for you to push your rehab or push yourself to get back on the field when you know your team's just going to be a doormat? Your team's just going to get dog walked. I mean, in 2023, this is a guy who we have to remember was an all-star despite being on a team that lost 100 games that year. He's lost over 320 games over the last 3 seasons. And look, he's a great fielder. The Mets obviously will have upgraded there. But you also just wonder how much the losing has just been a burden on him. You don't know. Like, it's been frustrating. I mean, this was a guy when he was 25 was able to only had 80 RBIs because no one's getting on base. Chicago. I'll play a game with you. Name me a Chicago White Sox. If you're a non-Chicago White Sox fan, heck, even if you are a Chicago White Sox fan, name me a Chicago White Sox. Currently. Not in the past, but currently. You can't because they're not a good baseball team. They do not have a good operation there. And there's a reason why they've lost and had a season a year removed from losing 121 baseball games. Basically, 1 out of every 4 times Luis Robert got in his car and drove to the ballpark, they were 1 out of 4 times was when they won. It's got to be incredibly frustrating. And this is a great change of scenery. He goes to a better lineup, and you go to a lineup now where a lot of guys are going to get on base for you. And this is a lineup, too, where you're going to be playing in big-time games. You're going to be in prime time. You're going to be able to be in front of people. People are going to actually watch your games. People are going to know who you are nationally because you're playing for a big-time team. And yes, the Mets have done a complete 180. They've blown up this core, which is something that a lot of people were begging for. And they've brought in a lot of guys who are incredibly hard workers, guys that you hear stories about how much they put into prep. And if they can get Luis Robert Jr. to buy in and even be 2/3 of the player he was in his all-star career, in his all-star year, if he hits 20-something home runs, knocks in 60 plus RBIs, plays gold glove caliber defense, and steals 25 to 35 bases. That is a great production out of center field. And it also allows the Mets to experiment in left field with a Brett Beatty, with a Carson Bench. Like, they don't now necessarily have to go out there. And I feel like at this point, they probably feel comfortable enough with this lineup that they're going to focus on pitching. And I think they're going to attack the pitching market. And don't be surprised if they use like a Mauricio, maybe it's a Vientos, but one of these prospects to land a big-time pitcher or a front-of-the-line type of pitcher, or at least a top 2 or 3 pitcher into the rotation. And I think it's smart. I mean, the Mets have shown you, and again, you can't say the Mets won't spend money. They spent money by absorbing this $20 million contract. They were going to give Kyle Tucker $60 million a year. They were going to spend money on the players that they really wanted. And I know a lot of Met fans, including myself, were hurt that Pete Alonso wasn't a part of this vision. But it's clear that for whatever reason, whether it be David Stearns, it was clear that he was not going to be long-term for this team. Because when the Mets did last year, when they gave him basically the one-year contract, you could kind of get the, well, it's great, but is he going to come back? Is this long-term? And like we've seen, it wasn't. And again, for first base, it's probably going to be Vientos. Maybe it's Beatty. Maybe Beatty plays left field. And Beatty, again, is a good athlete. And who knows, maybe the Mets bring in someone to compete. Maybe they bring in a Harrison Bader to be their 4th or 5th outfield, a guy that's a good defensive player, but a guy that can come in and pitch run. Those are the little moves that I think you have to keep an eye on, especially with the Mets at this point, are what little tweaks they make to the roster. And I mean, we've seen the big pieces, but just maybe who they try to build their bench with, who do they bring in as their pinch runner off the bench. That, to me, will be something to keep an eye on. But I do think their next move is going to be a pitcher. I really do. And I do think it's going to come through the trade market. I really believe that the Mets are not done. And they've done a very good job of building out this roster, making an adjustment. And look, they really wanted Kyle Tucker. They pivoted to Bo Bichette, and now they pick her. And look, I feel like the Mets' priority, they had their priorities. They weren't able to go after them, but they smartly moved on to really good ball players with contracts that they can get out of if it doesn't work out. Contracts, they're not going to kill them in the long term, but they're a good baseball team. It's a different lineup build than last year. Is this a lineup that has as much pop in it? No. But is this a lineup that's a lot more athletic now? Is this a lineup that's much more balanced now? And even Luis Robert, even if he's not a great average hitter, this is a guy that absolutely eats left-handed pitching, which is something the Mets have struggled with. Is, ironically enough, has been left-handed pitching. I just feel like I look at this lineup, it's more balanced now, and you're not asking too much of people. And what I mean by that is last year, you had the core 4. And then you had basically 4 to 5 players where you were asking them to either hit above their pay grade or really shine as young players. And again, young players are going to struggle. They put Alon Alvarez's plate. Alvarez kept getting hurt and couldn't get going. They put a lot on Vientos' plate, hoping for another 30 home run season. It didn't happen. On Beatty's plate, Mauricio's plate, Luis Angel Acuña's plate. Again, they had their moments, they had their stretches, but they weren't consistent throughout the season. And you also had positions like center field where you're asking Tyrone Taylor to be an everyday center fielder where he's clearly not an everyday center fielder after they went after Jose Siri, which was a disaster. And then you put Jeff McNeil out there, and then they put Cedric Mullins out there, who was so bad, despite the Mets trading for him, he never got to play down the second half of the season. And look, David Stearns made a lot of mistakes last year. But it feels like, to me, he's at least learning or at least understanding to pivot on these moves. And you could make the case that maybe Bo Bichette wasn't his first option, but you get a good righty stick. You get someone that, again, I know hasn't played third, but was, I think, a good enough shortstop where I think the transition won't be horrendous. And you stole him from a division rival. Now you get another really good center fielder. You get someone that is above the production you got last year. And even Bo Bichette consistently, Bo Bichette has been a really good stick and consistent stick in the lineup. Like, you know what you're going to get from Bo Bichette. Even Simeon with the declining production, you know you're going to get a great defending second baseman. Like, you know what he is. Last year, like we came into the season, we didn't know what Alvarez was going to be. And again, that's still a question with the catching position. You didn't know what you were going to get out of center. You didn't know what you were going to get out of left. Like it was a very inconsistent lineup and a very streaky lineup. Like this is a lineup that now feels like with Polanco, with Bo Bichette, at least it will be more consistent and not feast or famine. Like when the Mets offense was hot, it could burn 10 runs. But then how many weekend series will we see this team not be able to manufacture a run, or they weren't smart on the bases, or they weren't aggressive on the bases, or they weren't able to get those extra runs home? I think that they now have a different lineup. Again, it is a different lineup, and it's a lineup that has consistency, but also a lineup, and I think this is a great point, that's a lot of playoff experience. Bo Bichette has played in the postseason. It's been great in the postseason. Polanco's played in the postseason, has been a really good hitter. Even Simeon, despite his average, he's playing the postseason. Now, Luis Robert Jr. bucks that trend because, his season is basically over before opening day with the White Sox. But this is, I think, going to be a much healthier environment and a much better locker room. And I'm not saying that the guys that the Mets had as their core previously were bad guys or they were negative guys, they were backcourt. But it's clear that the Mets needed a change. Because as much as we talk about Pete Alonso, Brandon Nimmo, Jeff McNeil, and again, they are great players they've been great players for this organization. They've had a huge impact on this fan base, but at the end of the day, they weren't able to get over the hump. And you have guys now like Juan Soto, you have guys like Francisco Lindor, who have basically been through the wars. They've been in the playoffs. And look, the Mets are going to have to be a more savvy team. Like, especially with the Dodgers now, you have to be a savvy team. And this is going to be a tough division. Like, let's not forget, the Phillies are still a really good team in this division. The Marlins always somehow have the Mets number for whatever reason. The Braves are going to be healthier this year. And you look to, like, well, Washington, again, I don't think it's a big threat, but Washington, their younger players are starting to mature. I mean, I think they can be plucky like the Marlins. This is going to be a very difficult National League. This is going to still be a dogfight in this division. And look, there's still going to be teams that are going to come hard after the Mets because the Mets have one of the bigger payrolls in baseball. But David Stearns, I have to give him credit. He was aggressive. He had to make pivots. And to me, this was always kind of the trap card where Kyle Tucker was a prize that the Mets wanted. But they kind of knew in the back of their minds they could get this trade done because they knew that they were the only team that was willing to fully take on this contract, which, again, is a huge advantage to this baseball team. It's an advantage that they've been able to use in this league. And they got a really good player with a lot of potential. And I know the P word scares a lot of people because it's promises, it's hope. But even at the baseline, even if he's the same player he was last year and he only plays in 110 games and hits 15 home runs and hits 50-something RBIs and steals 30 bases and hits for 220, that's still better defensive production the Mets had. That's still better offensive production than the center field position had. Like, the Mets have upgraded this position. And they've maybe not upgraded the DH. Maybe they haven't upgraded first. Maybe they haven't upgraded third in terms of outward production. But I do think you've got a team that's going to be more consistent. They're going to be a team that's going to be a more consistent offense week in and week out. And look, there's going to be games where maybe they score only 1 or 2 runs, and it's a frustrating stretch. But I feel like they're going to be in more games, and there's going to be less peaks and valleys. Because, again, the big problem with, like, Pete Alonso and Brandon Nimmo, as much as we love those guys, when they're hot, they're great. But when they are cold, they are ice cold. They are not getting on base. They are not moving the order. They're striking out. They're not putting the ball in play. I still feel like with this order, you're still going to have guys that can struggle, but at least they're guys that are going to put the ball in play, are going to help you in this pitching staff, which, again, still needs work. But you're not telling me Nolan McLean isn't a better pitcher with Francisco Lindor at short, with Simeon at second. Now you have Luis Robert Jr. patrolling center field. Like, this is a much better defense than the Mets had last year. Jeff McNeil was an average to below average second baseman. The Mets have a potential Gold Glover now at second base. And look, I know defense isn't the sexiest thing in baseball. I get it. I know it's not going to sell the headlines. I get it's not the best thing to look at. But it is something where if the Mets are not going to have the best rotation and potentially the best lineup, you have to cut games or favor your games to you in different ways. And the two things that the Mets have unequivocally gotten better at this offseason is they've gotten guys who are better defenders, and they've also gotten guys who can steal more bases. I think the Mets will be one of the leaders in stolen bases next year. I think that if they are not top 3 or 4 in baseball in stolen bases next year, I'm going to be surprised. Because you have guys that are savvy that can steal 20 to 25 bags like Soto. You have guys that are fast like Lindor. But now you have guys like Luis Robert Jr. who could steal 20 to 30 bags. Carson Bench has decent speed. He can maybe steal 10. You have guys that are going to put pressure on pitching staffs. They're going to put pressure on catchers. And this is going to be a lineup that's going to be very different, but it might take some getting used to. But at the end of the day, I think it's a lineup that Met fans are going to be happy with. And I think it's going to be a productive lineup, or at least a lineup that can produce enough to the trade deadline where if you need a piece, Carson Bench maybe wasn't ready to be the everyday left fielder, or maybe Francisco Alvarez is injured and not producing, or maybe they feel like they finally need to plug first base full time. They have the money, they have the capital, and they have the draft prospects to make that happen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this episode of Rich Sports Talk. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss any of our latest videos. Also, check us out wherever podcasts are available and on social media using the handle @Rich Sports Talk. If you have ideas for future videos, make sure to comment below and make sure to like and subscribe and check out our community page on the channel. But until next time, I'm your host, Nolan Rich, and this has been Rich Sports Talk.